Eleanor.
Okay. Okay, so the agenda for this morning, I'll just quickly do an overview of the DBS and the different disclosure types and our charges. I'll then touch on tips and how to request DBS checks through us, and going over the ID documents that we require. And then I will go over the eligibility side of DBS and the update service. And then at the end, there's just some useful links. And then also should be some time for some questions if you have any. So what is the DBS? So the DBS stands for Disclosure and Barring Service. This helps employers make safer recruitment decisions for England, Wales, Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. DBS also managed the barred list, so adults and children's barred list, which is a list of individuals who are barred from engaging in regulated activity. It was previously known as the CRB, which you may have heard of. These checks provided detailed reports of an applicant's criminal record history, and this worked alongside the Independent Safeguarding Authority, which provided the barring element. These two then merged to create the DBS in 2012. So here at Stockport Council, we're both a responsible organisation and an umbrella body company. So a responsible organisation is an organisation registered with the DBS to submit basic checks. So an employer or an individual can apply for a basic check through a responsible organisation. And then an umbrella body company is an organisation registered with DBS to submit standard and enhanced checks. So an employer can they can request the standard and enhanced checks for those. So these are the different disclosure types. So you've got a basic check, which contains details of convictions and cautions that are considered to be unspent. So when we say unspent, we mean any criminal conviction that you're still in the rehabilitation process for. So not enough time has passed for the offence to be spent. And then you have a standard check, which contains details of all spent and unspent convictions and adult cautions which have not been filtered in line with legislation. So the spent convictions is a criminal offence that has completed that required rehabilitation period. And when we say filtered, so filtering is the process in which identifies which criminal records will be disclosed on a standard or enhanced check. And there is a list of offences which will always be disclosed, which are specified offences, and these tend to be quite serious offences. And then there's the enhanced checks, which contains the same information as a standard check, but it also includes a check of information held by police force against that workforce, so adults or children. And if the workforce is down as other, so they don't work with a particular workforce, then the police will look at this on the application form and reveal any information that they feel is relevant to the position. And then there is the barred list side, which will check against an adults or adults barred list. So these are people barred from working in regulated activity with that particular workforce. These are our charges, so it's split between the DBS charge and then the admin fee. So the DBS charge is what DBS charge us, and then the admin fee is what we charge on top of the DBS charge, which will then cover things like using the system that is managed by another company, and then just us processing that application form. So it does say £16 for the admin fee, but we have a reduced admin fee of £14 for charities and voluntary groups within Stockport. So those are our prices. So volunteer DBS check. I thought I'd just go over this just because you would probably deal with a lot of volunteers. You would want to DBS check a lot of volunteers. So I just thought it'd be super useful for you to just understand what a volunteer DBS check is. So DBS define a volunteer as a person engaged in an activity which involves spending time unpaid except for travel and other approved out-of-pocket expenses, doing something which aims to benefit some third party other than or in addition to a close relative. So they can't benefit from the volunteer work. If they do, say for example they're paid or they're getting some sort of qualification out of it, then it's not classed as a volunteer DBS check. So the DBS check is free of charge, but there is the admin fee side. But to qualify for a free of charge volunteer check, the applicant must not benefit financially from the position for which the application is being submitted, receive any payment except for the travel and other approved out-of-pocket expenses, be on a work placement, be in a trainee position or undertaking a course of study that will lead to a full-time role or qualification, and then be a foster carer or member of a foster care household. So if they've come to you as part of, if they're undertaking a course at a college or a university and they have to do some sort of work experience placement with you as a charity, then because they need to do that to gain that qualification, that's not classed as a volunteer DBS check, and it would have to go down the paid DBS check route. So the DBS fee is free of charge for standard and enhanced DBS checks, but they don't do a free of charge basic check. So if it's a basic, if you're needing it to do a basic check on a volunteer, then there's still that DBS fee, unfortunately. They only do it for the standard and enhanced checks. Okay, so how to request DBS checks through us. So usually the client organisation will contact us, so that'll be over the phone or through an email. We do have like an online form that you can complete on our website, and that will just send an email to us and we can contact you about that. So we'll discuss then the DBS check requirements. So we'll discuss what checks you need, how many checks, and we'll go through the eligibility with you. So the thing that we need to check is whether the client's requirements are legitimate. So are you entitled to request that level check or a check at all? If you're not, then we cannot process a check for you. If you are, and we're happy with that, then we will then send over our order form, our list of ID documents that we accept, and our policy statement and agreement. The client organisation then read through all of those documents, and that is just a Word document, and send that over to us with 3 forms of ID documents. So that can be sent through an email, or you can post that to us. We'll then review the order form and check that that's all in order, and we'll also look at the documents that you've provided. If it's not fully complete the order form, or there's information missing, or there's something we're not sure about, or if there's a particular ID document that we're unable to use, we'll then go back to the client organisation to advise what needs to happen. So that's the ID document. The client organisation should then make those necessary changes, so to the order form, or send over another ID document to replace the document that we're not able to accept. Once we've got all that information and we're happy with that, we will then make payment. So we'll arrange to either call the applicant so they can pay for the DBS check via card over the phone, or they can send a check in the post. Card payment is preferred just because it's a lot faster, but if you don't have like a company card and you prefer to do it via check, then that's absolutely fine. You can post a check to us. So once we've received payment, we will then create an application form for the applicant. So we will send an email to the applicant, who will receive an email with some login details and a link to our system. So they'll just have to click on the link and put in those login details, and an application form will be there for them to complete. It should take around 10-15 minutes for them to complete. It will just ask for their name, their address, like changes in their name or address, date of birth, place of birth, things like that. Once they've completed it, we will then check the application form. We'll check that the details that they've provided matches up with the documents that they've provided. So checking like the date of birth, the name is correct, the place of birth is correct, the current address they've put on there matches up with the documents that they've provided with their address on. Once we've checked that and that's all fine, we'll add the details of the documents onto the application form and we will submit that to DBS to then process. Once it's submitted to DBS for processing, the applicant will also get an email just with a tracking reference number. So they'll be able to go on the DBS website and track where their application form is up to, which stage it is up to along the process. So they can do that using that tracking reference number. So once it's processed, an email will be sent to the client, so that the person who's down as the person to receive the outcome of the check, they'll get an email to say this has been processed, this is a certificate number, this is the date of issue of the certificate. And alongside that, the applicant will also get a certificate in the post. For basic checks, there is an option to not receive a certificate in the post. So if you require a certificate, if the applicant needs a certificate, you need to ensure that they're selecting that on the application form to say that they need a physical certificate in the post. With a standard and enhanced check, they'll automatically just get the certificate in the post. So once you get that email, it's always a good idea to just mention to the applicant that they should be receiving a certificate in the post, just so that they can look out for that. Just in case it gets lost by the Royal Mail somewhere, then they know to expect the certificate in the post. On the email, you will also receive information of whether there's anything on the DBS, so if anything's been disclosed on there. If it says that there's information on there, you need to request to see that certificate, because the information that's on there will only be on the certificate. You're not emailed that information. We don't have access to that information. It's only on the certificate. So it's really important that you then see the certificate before making any sort of employment decision. So that's the entire process from start to finish of how to request checks. It's hard to tell how long it would take. It's really dependent on how quickly we can get the order form and documents from you, and depending on how quickly the applicant can complete the application form. But hopefully it will only take a few days on our side. Once it gets submitted to DBS, it's sort of out of our hands. It just depends. When DBS are processing, it depends on how busy they are, where it needs to go. But that's the overall process of how to request DBS checks through us. So this is just a screenshot of, I'm just going to go through the order form. It's not a complicated form, it's just a Word document, but I just thought it'd be super useful for you to know what that looks like and what information that we require from you to then start a DBS check. So it's split up into different sections. So section 1 will be the details of the person who will receive the outcome of the check. So that's the person who will put their contact information in. And once the DBS check is processed, that's the person who will receive the outcome of that DBS check. So usually it's the recruiting manager, or perhaps a manager within the HR department, or even the director of the company. So you just put those details in there. And then section 2 is the applicant's details. So that will just ask the name, the position that they'll hold with your organisation, their email address, so that we can then send the details of the application form to them. And it will also ask for the applicant's nationality. So here we only really need to know if they're a UK national or not, because that will depend on what ID documents we would require for them. And then it will ask what workforce they'll be working with. So is that children's, is that vulnerable adults, is it both or other? And then it will also ask if they will be working with those vulnerable groups in the applicant's home address. So that's if the applicant themselves will have vulnerable adults in their own address. That's not if the applicant goes to a vulnerable child or adult's house. That's if they have them in their own house. And then the next question is what level of check? So is it an enhanced? Is it a standard? Is it a basic? Is it an enhanced with barred list, both barred list, children's barred list, or just vulnerable adults barred list? So those three options there are all just drop down menus, so you can just pick from the options that come up what you require. And then the next section just goes over our costs again. So how much each level of check will cost. Obviously I mentioned before we do have the reduced fee of the £14 for the admin fee here for charity organisations within Stockport. And then section 4 will just let us know how you're wanting to pay. So whether that's a cheque or a card payment over the phone. This is also important to then who's paying for the order form and the list. Is it yourselves who will be paying? Is it someone else within the organisation who'll be paying, or is it the applicant themselves that will be paying and will need contact information? So like a telephone number for us to contact them to then make payment for the cheque. And again, those where it says select, those are just drop down menus of the prices. So you just pick the price that you'll be paying for. And then the final section is just the declaration. So this is just to confirm that you've read through all the documentation that we've sent, and you'll just need to sign that and date it. So we're happy for the electronic signature. So you don't have to print it, sign it, and then scan it back in. You can just electronically sign that. So that's our order form. Like I said, it's just a Word document that you'd need to complete and send over to us with the documents. And then moving on, I'll now look at the suitable ID documents, the documents that we can accept as part of the DBS process. So the applicant must provide 3 forms of ID documents as part of the process. As a client organisation, you must establish the true identity of an applicant through the examination of a range of ID documents. So you need to check that if they've provided a photo ID that you've checked that they look like that picture. All 3 documents collectively need to show their full name, date of birth and current address. All 3 documents need to be original documents and in date. So you can't accept things like if they've given you a photocopy of a passport, you can't accept that. You need to accept the physical passport. And they need to be in date, so they can't be an expired passport or driving license. All 3 documents need to be from the list of ID documents DBS accept, which I will go through in a moment what documents we can accept. So the documents are listed into different groups, and there are different ID verification routes depending on whether they're a UK or non-UK applicant and depending on what documents they can provide. This is why we ask on the order form whether they're a UK or non-UK applicant, just because we need to understand what sort of documents they need to provide so we can advise you. So things to remember, only accept, only accept valid, current and or original documentation, so you can't accept photocopies of documents. And you must try and obtain documents with photographs. So if they've got a passport or driving license, you must use that document. You must check that document and check that they look like the picture on their passport or driving license. All documents should be in the current name. Obviously, if it's a birth certificate, it may be in a previous name. So you need to be asking for the document that shows their change in name. So if that's a deed poll or a marriage certificate, you need to be asking for those documents as alongside, say, for example, the birth certificate. At least one document must show the applicant's date of birth. At least one of the documents must show the applicant's current address. So when you're checking these, it's if they've completed some sort of form onto a position or a paid position, it's always good to check at this point that the document matches up with what they've put on the application form. So is the address on the license, driving license, the same as the address that they've put on the application form? And if not, you'd need to go back to the applicant and query that. So we can only accept one document per category. So they're sort of split up into the groups, and then within those groups there's different documents we can accept. And one of those examples is a bank statement. So you can't accept two bank statements. So if you've got a bank account with one bank and another one with another, we can only accept the one bank statement. We can't accept the two. And just a reminder, don't accept photocopies or documentation printed from the internet. So nothing like a bank statement that's been downloaded or a utility bill. It has to be posted to them. And you can't accept the foreign equivalent of an identity document if that document is listed as UK on the list of valid ID documents, which I'll go over and you'll be in a minute and you'll be able to see that it says UK next to that document. So there's different routes depending on if they're a UK or non-UK applicant. There's different groups of documents as well. So for UK applicants and volunteer non-UK applicants, they need to be providing 3 documents from these 3 groups, which is Group 1, Group 2A and Group 2B. And then there's 3 routes depending on what documents they can provide that they can go down. That's Route 1, Route 2 and Route 3. And I'll go over those in a second. And then for paid non-UK applicants and for volunteer non-UK applicants applying for a basic check, they need to provide 3 documents from the 2 groups, primary documents and supporting documents. So the supporting documents are in fact the same groups of documents that are for the UK applicants. So the supporting documents are this Group 1, Group 2A and Group 2B. And then alongside that, they need to provide primary document, which again, I will go over in a second. Next, so this is for UK applicants applying for any level of check, and for non-UK applicants, volunteer non-UK applicants applying for a standard or an enhanced check. So this is the Group 1 documents. So most people will provide a passport or a current driving license. Those are probably our most common ones. And then there'll be some people who provide birth, but it has to have been issued with 12 months of birth. So when you're looking at the birth certificate, at the very bottom there should be like a registration date. That date needs to be within 12 months of their date of birth to be a Group 1 birth certificate. Other thing to note is this at the side, where it says UK, it needs to be a UK document. So we can't accept a birth certificate from another country. It has to fall under this category here. With the passport, it can be any current and valid passport, but you need to remember that they need to be applicants. So if they've got dual citizenship, they have a UK passport and a Spanish passport, for example, they can provide the Spanish passport as part of a Group 1 document because they are a UK applicant. And then next is the Group 2A. So here, I think most people probably from this group will supply the reissued birth certificate. So you can apply for a reissued birth certificate directly from the Gov website if you needed to provide something with your date of birth on. They can apply for that. I think they might have to pay a small fee as well. But most people provide that and a paper driving license. Those are probably our common ones. Just to note that the paper driving license needs to be issued before 1998, so it should have an issue date on there. Again, just noting where these need to have been issued. So where it says UK, it needs to be a UK document. You can provide a driving license from another country for a Group 2A document. Again, just checking that everything is in date as well, the same as Group 1, so checking that the driving license is still in date. And then Group 2B documents, most of these will have the applicant's current address on. So they can provide a mortgage statement, a bank statement, a credit card statement, council tax statement, utility bill. Those are probably our common ones. Just again to note where that document needs to come from. So to be a UK mortgage statement, can't have a mortgage elsewhere. And also just to note the issue date here. So depending on what document it is, it needs to have been issued within a certain time frame. So with the statements that are usually a yearly statement, it's usually issued within the last 12 months. So for your mortgage statement and your council tax statement tend to be a yearly statement, so they can be issued in the last 12 months. But things like the bank statement and the credit card statement, they need to be issued in the last 3 months. So just worth to note at the side here when they need to have been issued. And with anything like here, they need to be in date and have the correct information. If they've got a date of birth, it needs to have the correct date of birth on there. And just a reminder, with the statements, we can't accept anything that's downloaded from online. It has to have been sent to the applicant in the post. And also just a reminder, it has to have the applicant's current address on there as well. So those are the different documents that we can accept. I'll now go on to the different routes that they can go down depending on the documents that they can supply. So the first route is route 1. So all applicants must initially be considered for route 1. So if they've got a passport or driving license, you need to be asking for those documents in the first instance anyway, because they will have the photo ID on them, but they should be supplying a group 1 document if they can supply a group 1 document. So route 1 is 1 document from group 1 and then 2 further documents from any of the groups. So group 1, group 2A or group 2B. And one of them must have their current address on them. So an example would probably be a passport from group 1, and then they could provide a driving license from group 1 and then a bank statement from group 2B. So as I mentioned before, applicants must be asked if they have a passport and a valid UK driving license. And you must capture these details to indicate they do, and just to check that they need to provide that photo ID in the first instance. If they can't provide a document from group 1, then they can go down route 2. So with route 2, they need to supply 3 documents from the group 2. So that would be 1 document from group 2A and then 2 further documents from group 2A or 2B. So an example would be a reissued birth certificate. So a birth certificate that might have a year date of 2022 on it, that would be a reissued birth certificate. And then they might supply the bank statement from group 2B and maybe a council tax statement from group 2B. Again, one of them must show their current address. In addition to supplying these documents, they also need to have an external ID check. So this is done through the system automatically when we're adding the details of the documents onto the application form. This is done pretty instant on the system. So when we're at that stage, we'll then do the external ID check, and that will come back to say whether it's passed or failed. So if it's then that's great, we can just process that application. If it fails, they would then have to go down a route 3 or provide a document for route 1. Usually when it fails, it's because they don't have much of an online footprint, so Experian can't check their identity. And just to note as well that there is an extra charge of £12 to carry out that external ID check, and we are charged automatically as soon as we do that external ID check. So if you supply documents that are for route 2, we will then just remind you that there is that £12 fee, and we'll also just double check that they can't in fact supply documents for a route 1. Obviously if they can't and you're happy to pay that £12, then we'll do the route 2. But it's just to advise that it can sometimes come back as fail, and therefore they'd have to go down route 3. So route 3 it can be a bit difficult because they have to supply a lot of documents. So route 3, they need to have exhausted route 1 and route 2. So they have to have failed that external ID check. So route 3, they must provide a birth certificate. So that's that reissued birth certificate, which, as I said, they can apply for one through the Gov website. And then they need to supply 4 further documents from group 2, consisting of 1 document from group 2A, and then 3 further documents from either group 2A or 2B, where one of them must show their current address. So this is why it can be difficult, because not many people can provide an additional document from group 2A. If you remember from group 2A, there's the marriage certificate, the paper driving license, and the birth certificate, but they have to have given the birth certificate as one of the documents. So that only really leaves the marriage certificate or the paper driving license or the license from another country, but most people won't have those documents. So if you've not been married or you've never had a paper driving license, then it's difficult for someone to go down route 3 because they can't provide that additional group 2A document. This is where we advise that perhaps they try and obtain a group 1 document. So if they were going to apply for a provisional license anyway, perhaps they could apply for one or renew a passport. Or if they knew they had their original birth certificate, perhaps they could just find the birth certificate, and that would save them a lot of time. Because if they can't go down route 3, we then have to they would then have to apply for a DBS through a paper application form. And this can take a really long time. They have to complete the paper application form, and they have to go down to their local police station to have fingerprints taken. We submit that to DBS, and there's a lot of back and forth with the application form before the actual process of processing a DBS application form starts. So it can take months to go down that route, which is why we advise we ask whether they can provide a group 1 document just to save time, because you'd be just waiting a really long time before you can recruit that person into the job role if they require a DBS check. So those are the different routes. Most people will go down route 1, and we should be seeking documentation for route 1. But those are the 3 routes that the applicant can go down. Then next, I'm just going to look at people who are a non-UK applicants. So this is for paid non-UK applicants, and then also volunteer non-UK applicants applying for a basic. So we're of the primary documents just because there's quite a few of them and there's a lot of text on these pages. But as I mentioned before, they need to provide a primary document and then 2 supporting documents. So the primary documents, I'll just go over the ones that we probably get most commonly. So probably a passport with a visa within it, or a biometric residency permit, or the most common one nowadays is this online evidence, which you might be aware of if you're having to check someone's right to work. So that's just when they give you a share code, and you can go on the View and Prove service, put in that share code, and it will tell you their immigrant status, and it will give you can download like a PDF, and you can send that PDF to us, and that will be down as a primary document. So once they've given you a primary document, they would need to give you 2 supporting documents. These are just more primary documents, which you can go over in your own time. The supporting documents, as I mentioned, are the same documents as a UK applicant. So they're split up into that group 1, group 2A and group 2B again. So just noting again where that document needs to come from and the date. With the group 1, they can supply, if they've not given a passport as part of the primary document, they can supply their passport from the country that they have come from as their group 1 document. But again, they need to be giving a document with a date of birth and their current address on it. And again, just to know that we can't accept documents that have been downloaded. It needs to be posted to them. So those are the documents for the non-UK applicants. And then, like I said before, the route being they have to, there's only the one route, so they have to provide that primary document and then 2 further supporting documents. I'll now go over onto eligibility. So I'm not going to go into loads and loads of detail about this just because it can get very, very complicated and confusing. So I'm going to go over the sorts of questions that we would ask if you were to contact us and request DBS checks. So we'll ask certain questions to then determine what level of check you're entitled to request. So there's no eligibility requirement for a basic DBS check. So you can request your own check, or you can request a check on someone that you're employing. You don't need to be eligible for that. You can just request it if you want to DBS check someone, but that you consent from the person before you request a basic DBS check. As an employer, you can only legally request a standard or enhanced DBS check that the job role is eligible for, and you can only legally request a DBS check against the workforce they're working with. So if you're working with children, you can't then request a check against an adult's workforce because they're not working with adults. So these are the sorts of questions that we would ask when we're determining what level of check you're entitled to request. So the first one being what workforce. So are they working with children? Are they working with vulnerable adults? Are they working with both? If they're working or volunteering with vulnerable adults, is it wholly or mainly with vulnerable adults? So for example, if they're providing some sort of course or class, which is open to any adults, and there's a chance that a vulnerable adult may join the class, that's not classed as working wholly or mainly with vulnerable adults. It needs to be a class that's aimed at vulnerable adults to be to hit that criteria. And then what sort of work or volunteer work will they be carrying out? So why does that role require a DBS check? Are they providing healthcare or personal care? Are they teaching or supervising children? Or are they just carrying out admin work where they may have access to personal data? And another thing to note, if they are carrying out, say they're doing admin work, but you think that they might supervise children, but you're not really sure, and we can only request the level of check of the work that they will be carrying out. We can't do it based on what they may or may not do. So it needs to be what they will be doing. Obviously, if they then carry out a role that requires them to have an enhanced check, or they're in regulated activity, we can then request that level of check for you. And then the next question is, where will that work or volunteer work take place? So DBS have a list of specified places when working with children. So that's schools, children's centres, children's home, nurseries, children's detention centres. These are all a list of specified places when working with children, and they don't really have any specified places for vulnerable adults, but they do have, if you're working in a care home, it's sort of a specified place. So if they hit other criteria whilst working in a care home that isn't directly caring for adults, then they may be entitled to an enhanced check. And then the other question we ask is, how often will they be carrying out that work or volunteer work, or how often are they going into that specified place? How often are they going into the school, for example? So is that once a week? Is it more than 3 days in a 30-day period, or is it overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 p.m.? So this is from the DBS website. This is what they want us to ask to establish what level of check you're entitled to see. If they're providing healthcare or personal care, they only need to do the activity once to be in regulated activity. But with other things, if they're teaching or supervising, we'd ask the question of how often will they be carrying out that role. And then the final thing we ask if they're working with children is, will they be supervised? So will the applicant be supervised by someone in regulated activity? So are they supervised by someone who's been checked against that barred list check? If they're working with children and parents present, then they're only entitled to the basic check because parents or guardians are present there with their child. And it's also important to establish if there is sufficient supervision when requesting a DBS check on a volunteer. So when it comes to volunteers, that will determine whether they're in regulated activity or not in some cases. So I will just quickly go over some examples. These I've taken directly from the DBS website. There's only a few examples. I've not touched loads just because there's a lot of information on there, but there's loads of examples on the DBS website and look at. So I've only really pulled ones that I feel that we do the most DBS checks for. So the first one being volunteering in schools. So if they're providing that personal care, so helping a child to eat or drink, or providing healthcare, then you only have to do it once to be in regulated activity. They're entitled to the Enhanced with Children's Barred list. If they are going into schools and teaching or training or caring for a child within the school, they need to be doing it often enough to be in regulated activity. So if they're not, then they may not be in regulated activity and therefore not entitled to the barred list side of the check. If they're going into schools, but not specifically for teaching or training, but they're going in doing some volunteer work in a school, do they have opportunity to have contact with the children? Are they working or volunteering for the purpose? It's not temporary occasional work, and if they're unsupervised by someone else in regulated activity, and they again once doing it often enough, then they're in regulated activity and therefore entitled to the Enhanced with Children's Barred list. If they're doing the above, but they are supervised by someone else in regulated activity, then they're not in regulated activity themselves as a volunteer, but they're entitled to the enhanced check because they're going into a specified place, i.e. the school. This is quite similar for paid workers, except they can still be supervised by someone else in regulated activity to be in regulated activity, so they can be entitled to the enhanced check with children's barred list if they are supervised, if they're a paid worker. It's always a good idea to have a conversation with the school just so that you're aware of what supervision they can provide. And then just worth to note that if you're just hiring a space within a school like the hall, but not sort of engaging with the children in the school, you're just hiring a space, then it's only a basic check. However, if you're coming in to provide like a dance class for the children within the school, then you can carry out that enhanced check because you're providing a service to that school and in contact with those children of that school. And then the next is just counselling and mentoring roles with children. So this is to show why we ask how often, because this will determine whether they're in regulated activity or not. So they could be doing the exact same work, but they might not be doing it often enough and therefore only be entitled to the enhanced check. But if they are doing it often enough, then they are in regulated activity and therefore you can carry out the enhanced check with children's barred list. Driving for a charity, we do a couple of checks for a couple of charities within Stockport for this, which is why I've included it. So if they are driving and it's done part of a formal third-party arrangement, for example, a school bus service, and the vehicle is for conveying children, and they're doing it often enough, then they're in regulated activity. If they're not doing it, but they are doing then it's just the enhanced check only. For adults, it's slightly different, but they still do need to be done as part of the formal third-party arrangement. So for the example here is the hospital transport service, but they have to be driving the vulnerable adults to and from a place that they're receiving healthcare, personal care or social work, and they need to be vulnerable because of their age, illness or disability. But they only have to do it once to be in regulated activity with the adults. So therefore you can do the enhanced with adults barred list. If you're driving vulnerable adults and it's not to and from a place they're receiving their healthcare, personal care or social work, but you're driving them for such as trips as leisure, and the adults are vulnerable and they're in receipt of some sort of health or social care, and you're doing it often enough, then you can do an enhanced check, but they're not in regulated activity. So that's driving for a charity. And you can also, this information also applies for anyone assisting children or vulnerable adults. So for example, if someone's there to help them get out the vehicle, you can then apply this to them and carry at that level of check. And then the final one is just delivering workshops. So this is quite a common one. So if they are teaching, training or instructing children and they're unsupervised, and once again they're doing it often enough, then they're in regulated activity and you can do an enhanced check with children's barred list. If they are teaching, training children, but they are supervised by someone else in regulated activity, so if someone's there who's been checked against the barred list and you're also wanting a volunteer to also assist that person, then that volunteer will be supervised by someone who's been checked and therefore will only be entitled to the enhanced check. Once again, noting that you need to be doing it often enough. When it comes to adults, this is just a reminder that the workshop needs to be aimed at vulnerable adults and it can't just be a workshop or class that's open to any adults. And you need to be providing some sort of care, treatment, therapy, teaching, training, advice or guidance to those vulnerable adults. And again, doing this often enough to be entitled to enhanced check. So you're not in regulated activity because you're not providing personal or healthcare, you're just providing some sort of advice or training to those vulnerable adults. And when I mentioned that there wasn't really any specified places for adults, but I did mention the care home, this is an example of people who go into care homes who aren't providing any sort of personal care, but maybe they are providing a workshop within the care home and they're going in often enough, then you can do the enhanced check because they are going into a care home, which is specifically for vulnerable adults. So those are all the examples that I've pulled from the DBS website. Again, there's loads on there that you can go through. And if there's anything specific that you're wanting to talk about, of a specific role, then you can just give us a call or you can email into us. It's slightly easier to have that conversation to you directly rather than me saying on here, just because it can get very, very confusing and there's just a lot of criteria that they need to hit before they're entitled to certain levels of checks. And then, so we'll move on to the update service. So the update service, I just thought I'd go through this. You might be already aware of what this is, but I just thought it'd be super useful because if you've got volunteers that come and go, it can be quite useful if they've registered with the update service, and if you accept the DBS on the update service, then you can have them come and go and just check them as and when they come back. So you don't have to then do a whole new check and wait for the check to come back before you offer any sort of volunteer work with them. So the update service is an online that lets them carry out a free instant online check to view the status of an existing standard or an enhanced DBS certificate. So the person can't register a basic certificate on there, it's just a standard or an enhanced check. So you can only check you've got the individual's consent. Really important that they've given you consent to look at that DBS and the update service. And you can only check if you are legally entitled to request that check. So if they went on the update service and you needed to request a whole new check, are you legally entitled to request that check in the first place? And you need to be able to request that check that's against the correct workforce. So if they're working with children, your organisation just works with children, but their check is a children's and adults enhanced check, you can't check that because it's got the adult side on there. So it might have information to do with adults workforce, which you're not entitled to see. So it needs to be the correct workforce. So it will cost the applicant £13 a year to register a DBS on the update service. This is free for volunteers. So if they've got a volunteer DBS check, they can register it free of charge on there. So it won't cost them to put that on there. And they can also put multiple DBS checks on there, so they don't have to pay the £13 for every check they put on there. They could put, if they've got 2 checks they want to register the update service, they only have to pay the one £13 fee to register that on there. And this just allows individuals to be able to take it from role to role. So for example, if you've got someone who is a paid worker and they've put a DBS on the update service and they get a job elsewhere, but they still want to do some volunteer work with you, and the volunteer work is similar to what they've been doing and therefore was the correct level of check and correct workforce, you can then look at that DBS and the update service, and then they can just carry on doing volunteer work with you. They can take up that volunteer work with you without having to do a brand new check. It's just worth to note though, if it happens the other way around, so if they're volunteering with you and they've registered DBS on the update service, and that's a free DBS on the update service, you can't use that DBS for a paid role. They would then have to apply, you'd have to apply for a new DBS for them, because you can't use a volunteer DBS for a paid role, but you can use it the other way around, so you can use a paid DBS for a volunteer role. Okay, so there isn't a registration fee for you to pay for when you're checking for a DBS in the update service, which is why it's super useful, because you don't have to register an account, you don't have to pay any sort of money to check a DBS on the update service, but you must be legally entitled to carry out that check and have the applicant's consent. So when we say legally entitled, you need to have the right to ask the exempt question, so the right to see that's the spent conviction information, which is not protected. And you need to be legally entitled to request that level of check in relation to the role that they'll be doing. So checking that you're eligible for that level of check. As I've mentioned a couple of times, and I'll mention again, you need to have the individual's consent when carrying out a status check. You can't just check a DBS on the update service without their consent. And you need to see the original DBS certificate. So when you do check a DBS on the update service, a couple of things, different things come back depending on whether it's on there or not, and whether there's any new information that's been disclosed. So if it says that there isn't, they couldn't find the details, either you've put in the incorrect details or they've supplied the incorrect details. So that it will ask for the date of birth, the name, and the certificate number. So you might have accidentally put in the incorrect on the certificate number. So just double check the information in. Or if it comes back with no results, then it means that they've not registered the DBS on the update service, and you therefore may need to request a new DBS check for them. Or it will say there's no new information on there. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no positive disclosure on the original DBS certificate, which is why it's really important that you see the original DBS certificate, because it won't reveal any information. It will just say there's no new information, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a positive disclosure on the original DBS check that they've registered the update service. So you'd need to check that there's nothing on there. If it says there's new information that's been disclosed, that means there's new information from since the certificate was carried out. So you therefore need to request a new DBS check to then see what that information is. If you continue to carry out status checks on their certificate, so if they've left and you continue to carry out checks or you've not got their consent, then you are breaking the law by accessing that data and that you're not entitled to see. And if you check on the update service, so it'll ask for your name and the organisation that you're checking the DBS for, they will then be able to see who's viewed that DBS on the update service. It will notify them on their account. So these are just some useful links that you might need. So there's the eligibility guide. So on there, they've got a tool that you can use to check the eligibility guide. There's the legislations on there. So all the wording that they have on there to do with enhanced and standard checks and to do with that particular workforce, that can all be found on there. And then the link to the DBS ID checking guidance. So that's the list of ID documents that DBS accept. So all that information is on there, all the different groups, all the different routes, and also information on how to check the documents as well. If you're unsure of how to check official documents, there's a bit of guidance on there about that as well. And then I've also just linked the working with children in the charity sector and working with adults in the charity sector. So when I went through the eligibility examples, I took them from those web pages. So there's loads more examples on there, and it goes into a little bit more detail as well about DBS checking within the charity sector. And then I've also just linked our Stockport Council DBS website, which has information on about our service and our contact information on there as well. And that is everything. That's our contact information. Has anyone got any questions?